and welcome to the first episode of Back to Basics. Now, I put an announcement on my Facebook page a couple of weeks ago to say that I was going to be starting this series. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm fully aware that I am a bit of a basing addict. I don't spend a lot of time painting minis anymore. I tend to spend all my time coming up with new bases and mini dioramas. And I put a lot of time into them. I'm quite happy to put hours and hours into a single base. But I appreciate that I'm probably the exception to the rule, and that most people paint minis for the minis. And then painting the bases is just something that they potentially want to do quite quickly just to finish off. Especially if you're painting massive armies. You know, if you've got 10 Space Marines that you've just spent hours and hours painting, you don't then want to spend hours basing them as well. Some people do and some people don't. And I wanted my channel to appeal to everybody who's in the hobby. So I decided to do some experimenting and try and come up with some kind of quick and dirty methods for doing simple but effective bases. So the aim of this series is that I'm going to show you how to make bases that take maybe 5 minutes. Excluding drying times, of course, because obviously I don't have a magic wand, I can't do anything about that. But just to give people some inspiration, some ideas that's a little bit more than just putting on some PVA glue and dipping it in static grass, but something that's a lot less than some of the really detailed bases that I do. And I also appreciate that not everybody has all of the materials that I use. I was very lucky that when I started making bases, I had a little bit of spare income and I could afford to buy all these bits and pieces to try. But not everybody is that fortunate, and I don't want to make videos that prevent people from being able to make these because they haven't got all the materials. So the goal is to create bases that take 5 minutes or less and only use a few widely available materials. But on the flip side of that, what I'm also going to do is try and show these bases in stages. So I will do a 5-minute base that looks great. But then, for those of you who do want to maybe spice it up a little bit more, at the end of every video, I will show you something else that you could do with that base if you wanted to take it a step further. And it just means that it makes it a bit more accessible, and that you'll be able to make these bases whether you want to spend the time or you don't, and whether you have the materials or you don't. So I hope you enjoy this series, and I hope it's useful for people. Obviously, you're more than free to let me know. If you think it's a rubbish idea, tell me it's a rubbish idea and I'll stop. But if you think it's a good idea, I'll carry on doing it. So the first video today is about how to make simple wet mud. So let's head to the table and I'll see you in a bit. So as I said, I want these videos to be accessible people. I want people to be able to recreate these bases using what they've already got at home without having to go out and buy specialised products or materials. So for this particular mud base, I'm actually going to show you 2 ways to achieve the same effect. So hopefully you will have at least one of the main products in your collection somewhere. So for the first one, I'm going to be using Citadel's Sterling Battlemire, which I think is something that people are quite likely to have in their collection or something similar. So this is a brown, gritty texture paint. But there might be some people out there who just have a white texture paint. So this is Vallejo Rough Pumice. So I'm going to show you how to make it using both of these. Obviously, the only difference really is that you'd have to paint this. But I'll show you both and then you can decide which you think looks better. I don't think there's much difference between the two, but I will leave that decision to you. So these are my wooden bases that I've used in a lot of my videos. And because I'm applying stuff straight to them, I've given them a quick prime before I put anything on them. just so that they've got that protective layer and they don't start absorbing everything, because then you run the risk of things coming off and being a bit fragile. So for this first one, I'm just going to take a good chunk of, if I can get it out of the pot, of my Sterling Battlemire, and I'm going to start spreading it on my base. And this is one of those situations where you do not have to be neat. You can just blob it on however you want. There we go. Oops. One extreme to the other. And there we go. So we can just start flattening this down and making it look like a big muddy mess. Just get it all the way to the edges. Push it down. And then you can put some shape to it. You can make some puddles, however you want it to look. And once you're happy that you've got your texture where you want it, you can just leave this one to dry, and this will be ready for dry brushing straight away. And the good thing about this method is that this is slightly easier to do if you, unlike me, you like to leave your models attached to the base, because you can just, once you've painted your mini, you can just, you know, squish this on and spread it around between the miniature's feet and all around it, and it will even give it that more authentic look, because you might get some of this on his feet, which, you know, if you're trudging through mud, you get mud up your legs. So if you're going to do it with the mini attached and you're going to use Sterling Battlemire, I would recommend doing this as your last step once you've finished painting. On the flip side of that, if you're going to use the white pumice, I would recommend putting this on the base of the mini before you even prime the mini, if you're leaving the mini attached. And the reason for that is because you're going to be painting this, and because this is white, if you get this kind of up the legs of your model, it's going to be a bit of a pain to neaten off. So if you're doing this with the mini attached with this white stuff, put this on before you prime, then paint your mini and incorporate painting this into your painting scheme as you're working through. So we'll just smush this around all the way to the edges. Oops. I need to look at my computer screen more, I do apologise. And you can again make some holes and puddles and things like that. Just make it look a bit messy. So then we're going to leave those to dry. And this white pumice, I would always leave this overnight to dry before you paint any of it, just because it dries very well on the outside, but then it stays kind of gooey and squidgy in the middle, and sometimes if you try and paint it, it just smushes. So leave it for a good 12 hours. And the same with this, really. It doesn't hurt to leave it a little bit longer. You can keep coming and checking on it if you want, but I would recommend doing it on a night and then leaving it until the morning. So once these are dry, we'll be back and I will show you the next steps. So both of these have been left to dry. So this is the Citadel Sterling Battlemire, and this is the Vallejo white pumice that I have painted with Citadel's Dryad bark. So you can see the colour is very similar. The texture is slightly different. This is slightly more jagged and spiky, and this one's kind of got more roundish puddles and dips in it. But even at this point, you know, if you were to just leave it like that and put your mini on it, it would look like dirt. So, you know, even if you wanted to stop there, that would give you a nice textured base for your minis. But we're not going to stop there. We are going to move on to some dry brushing. And for this, I'm going to use Citadel's Steel Legion Drab and Zandri Dust. So they're the paler brown and sandy colours. So we're going to start off with some Steel Legion Drab. And all I'm going to do is put some on my trusty kitchen roll. Just a nice blob. And then you don't really need to be careful with this. So I'm using a big dry brush. And I'm just going to mash that into the bristles and wipe the majority of it off. And then test it on my thumb. And yeah, there's a little bit of colour coming off. So I'm going to take the first base and I'm going to be quite liberal with this. And maybe put a bit more on. Hopefully you can see that subtly changing colour. So it just lightens it a tiny bit. I'll put some more paint on and we'll do the other one. So the reason I do this is because you'll know yourself, mud isn't just one brown, one colour. There's various layers to it, and the light would be catching it, and all of this dry brushing just serves to make the end product just look that little bit more realistic, a little bit more organic. So there we go with the Steel Legion Drab, and you can see already that it's just got that nice contrast to it now. So then we're going to go for some Zandri Dust. Now we don't need as much of this. This is literally just to put a couple of highlights, and it helps to add to the kind of wet look that we're going to achieve with this by just highlighting the very tips of these mounds to make it look like the light is reflecting off the water. Now you won't notice because you're not on camera. You'll see that I haven't washed my brush in between, and that's because we don't want the contrast to be too obvious between these two layers of dry brushing. So I've left the Steel Legion Drab in my brush, and now I'm just mixing it in with some Zandri Dust. So then we're just going to apply a really light flick over all the highest parts. Like I say, not being too heavy-handed with this one. It's just for some subtle highlights. And then we'll get some more, and we'll do the same with this one. There we go. So if you wanted, you could leave them like that. That's entirely up to you. You could just do the dry brushing and that's it done, because it, you know, it looks like dirt. If you want to take it to the next step and really bring out that element that it is wet mud, this is what I do. I go over the whole thing with Agrax Earthshade Gloss. Now, from what I've heard, these gloss shades get a bit of a bad rep. And I can see why. I wouldn't use this on a miniature. You know, I wouldn't use the Reichland Flesh Shade gloss on a miniature because I wouldn't want a skin tone to look like that and have that glossy texture to it. But for basing and for creating, you know, any kind of wet look effect on a base, I think these gloss shades are fantastic. So, Agrax Earthshade Gloss for the win, for the mud. So all I'm going to do with this is take it straight out of the pot onto my brush, and I'm just going to liberally coat the whole base and hit my camera with my paintbrush at the same time. So, and you can see that's settling into all the recesses, and it's dumbing down those highlights we did so they're not as bright, but it's also darkening the recesses, so the kind of the level of contrast stays the same, if you see what I mean. Everything's just a couple of shades darker. And when we come back and these have dried, you will be able to see why I use the gloss. Because at the moment, this just looks like anything that you've put a shade on. It's wet. You know, a shade is, what, 90% water? I've got no idea. But you can see here that these look wet. Now, the thing with these gloss shades is that when they dry, these will still look wet, and that will give you that realistic mud look. So, I'll leave these dry, and then I'll show you the result at the end. These have dried now. As you probably know, shades dry quite quickly, and the gloss dries just as quickly. So, as you can see, it's still got some of that glossy, wet look to it. Now, in my experience, for some reason, I'm not sure why, the white Vallejo Pumice painted seems to take the gloss a little bit better. This is the one that was just the still in Battlemire that's then been dry brushed and glossed, and it doesn't have quite the same shiny feel to it. But if you wanted, you could add another layer of the gloss, and that would heighten that. But the other thing you can do, now obviously this series is about quick bases, and I know this is a relatively long video, but that's just because I waffle on about things because I'm interested in them. But these bases can be made in about 5 minutes, excluding drying time. So you just put the stuff on, leave it to dry, paint this one, leave it to dry, dry brush, gloss, done. Really, really quick effects. And that's what this series is about. But what I also want to do is show you how you can take them to the next level if you wanted to spend a bit more time. So these two are just your basic mud. But then I've also done these two. Now, with this one, you can see that there's a slightly different texture to it. And what I did with this one is in kind of the recesses here where you might get puddles forming if it's been raining, I've taken some Vallejo water texture and I've mixed it with the Dryad bark paint, just one tiny drop. And then I've just blobbed that in to all of these little puddly bits. And as you can see, hopefully, it just adds a little extra layer of slightly different coloured, different textured mud, as if you've got a few muddy puddles. And then on this one, I also put some little rocks, some boulders on, and just embedded those into the white pumice, and then did everything else exactly the same. I painted it all in the Dryad bark, I dry brushed it all with the same colours, and then added some of the water texture to give it that muddy, sploshy look. So, quick and easy, or if you want to take another couple of minutes and add an extra step, but it's completely up to you, whatever kind of aesthetic you're going for. So there you go. That's my method for making simple wet mud bases. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so that you can be made aware of when I release new content. I'm also on Facebook, Debsworth's Hobby Studio, and I'm on Instagram as well, and you can find me on there under the same name. And on both of those platforms, I just post pictures of what I'm working on and what I'm up to. So I will be back on Saturday with another all about depth base video, and until then, happy hobbying.